Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by
Josiah Neeley. I'm the Texas Director of the R Street Institute. We're a free market-oriented research organization.
Great, thanks for coming on with me, Josiah. There are a couple different topics that I want to get to today, but you guys do a lot of work on energy policy and specifically kind of state-based municipal regulation of energy policy, in addition to some national stuff, which we will get to later. But I wanted to have you on to run down, and R Street has written a little bit about this, and hopefully we can get some of those links in the video below on the debate over net metering and some of the political coalitions and cleavages that work in that arena. So for the uninformed, net metering is a policy that has roots in the 1970s, basically where consumers and constituents whose houses are on an electricity grid, where they would traditionally buy electricity from a utility company, can generate their own energy. And we've seen a fairly large explosion in the home generated energy market in the last decade or so, mainly due to the now affordability and portability of solar panels. And, we're seeing people, traditionally we think of, well, not we, but in the past, solar panels were kind of for homes that might have been maintained off the grid, maybe in the remote wilds, because the expense of them was such that, it was kind of exorbitant for people who lived in a city, people who lived on a mainstream electricity grid to generate their own electricity. So it was kind of more for roughing it, for places where you're not on the grid, for places where it's difficult for electricity to reach you. But the kind of mass market production of smaller and home-based solar panels has made it a lot more feasible for people nowadays. And what net metering is a policy where home generators of electricity can sell that electricity back to the utility company if you're on the grid. Now, in some places, it's mandated. If you're on the grid, you have a solar panel and you generate solar power, the electricity company has to buy it back to you, and they have to buy it back at certain rates. What we're seeing in the last couple of months, year or so, is that there's a differentiation in price that regulators have put in for some of these net metering policies, where the utilities will either buy back the electricity at what's called the wholesale rate, which is, basically buying in bulk, or the retail rate, which is the rate that utilities sell electricity to the consumers traditionally. And in a lot of different places, it was mandated that electricity companies buy from consumers at the retail rate. This resulted in kind of an explosion of solar companies because, it made a ton of sense for home generators of electricity to save a ton on their energy bills by generating their own and then getting rebates by selling that electricity back. We've seen both legislative and policy fight in a bunch of different states recently over raising some of those rates from the lowering some of those buyback rates from the retail rate to the wholesale rate. And this has caused a lot of consternation among both, solar consumers, people who have solar panels, and a lot of the new solar energy companies who are very much against this. In Nevada earlier this year, they changed the rate that utility companies had to buy from consumers from the retail rate to the wholesale rate. And Solar City, which is one of the largest solar companies in the country, announced that they weren't doing any business in Nevada anymore. They were pulling out of the state. So, all of that being said, Josiah, where do conservative politics play into this net metering debate? Because, it's not the traditional economic argument here where you have lots of competing companies and we say market-based power is the best way to go because we accept the natural monopoly status of a utility company. So where are conservatives falling on this debate, and how does that matter for some of the net metering fights that we're seeing?
Yeah, so that's an excellent summary. And I think if you want to look at uh, the net metering issue from a conservative or a market-based perspective or whatnot, there's a couple things I think you need to keep in mind. First, as you noted, is that we're talking about it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but a lot of jurisdictions, electricity is basically a monopoly. You know, there's not legally allowed to be competition. If you want to buy electricity, you only have one choice, and so that that presents a problem uh, when you're talking about something like net metering, because you don't have under a system of competition. If an individual was generating electricity in their own house, there would be an incentive for different companies to try and offer attractive buyback provisions in order to get the person's business. Whereas if you only have a single utility that the person buys from, actually you as a person with solar panels on their house or other distributed generation, you're actually the only competition for the utility. And so they have a pretty big incentive to do whatever they can to make sure that that can't happen. And so that's sort of, I think, where the issue of the mandate, that they have to actually buy back, where the justification for that comes in. It would be if you're in a deregulated market like I am here in Texas, then net metering is more of a decision that's worked out between the company and the individual. And we don't have a mandate for net metering here in Texas, in the competitive zones at least. But if you're only dealing with a single company, if you're dealing with a monopoly, then you have to have some regulation of that. Traditionally, of course, as you noted, net metering is reimbursed at the full retail rate, and that wasn't. I don't. That largely was not a policy decision so much as it was a technological decision. In that, now there's a lot of talk about what you call smart meters. Back when these policies were first put into place, meters were all very dumb, and most places just had a single meter, and it could only go forward or back. So there was no way to differentiate of you're buying at 8 cents and you're selling at 5 cents or whatever, right? You just had to do it. Now with the more advanced meters, it's possible to differentiate and say, okay, you can buy at one rate, sell at another rate. You can actually change the rate depending on the time and other factors. The third, the key aspect that I think is important here is, and why there's so much controversy about, whether it should be the retail rate or some other rate. So, when you buy electricity off the grid, you're buying various things. You're buying the actual electricity, but there are also costs that are involved just in maintaining the grid, laying transmission lines and wires, other sorts of things like that. And there's also capacity costs. The fact is that right now, electricity is not really stored. Any electricity that you use in your house has to be generated almost instantaneously at the same time. And what that means is that there has to be enough electrical capacity just sitting around to meet peak demand for the entire system. So there are a bunch of power plants that just only get turned on a few times a year during the hottest days of the summer, perhaps, or you have plants that operate well below what they could be because they need to have reserve capacity for when everybody gets home and turns on their AC and all that. So those costs could be broken out in electric bill for industrial, some commercial customers. The way their bills are set up is they have different charges. They have a charge for how much power they use, but they also have uh, a formula for charges that's based on how much power, like what's the maximum amount of power that they use at any given time, and other things like that. That hasn't been the case for retail. They basically charge one single retail rate, and it's a rate that is supposed to kind of recoup all the costs. They're all kind of thrown together. But when I, as an individual, sell power back onto the grid, that doesn't necessarily include those costs. I'm giving them just the power. I'm not necessarily, I'm not giving them any cost to deal with grid maintenance per se. I may not be, lessening their overall capacity requirements, how much they have in reserve. Although, depending on the situation, I may be helping that, right? It can be very complicated, and so those are kind of the issues. And as long as my perspective, at least, as long as net metering is or was a small overall, small percentage of the overall electricity generated, it really didn't matter much one way or the other. Even if there was some cost shifting back and forth, it's not a serious issue. But as we see the success and growth of solar, other distributed generation, people are using, taking advantage of the net metering a lot more. As it grows, it becomes a more serious issue. So I think ultimately you're going to have to move beyond net metering in some form or fashion. We can talk about what exactly that might look like.
Right. Now, on the issue of how much of a subsidy is it, I kind of, at least, selling at the retail rate, I kind of come down on it's a fairly large subsidy. And this is not taking into account the climate change impacts, right? Like those would be some externalities that would need to be priced in completely otherwise. And we can say it's worth it to make the utility companies, which are generating generally with dirtier sources of electricity than solar panels, that it... other than those aspects, the retail rate does seem to me to be a subsidy. And off of that, I wanted to get into what's called solar leasing. So there are basically two ways that people get solar panels in private homes right now. And that's you buy them, or what kind of became a business in the late aughts, a fairly large one at least, it grew up, it was solar leasing, where solar panel companies like Solar City, for example, would take a large hit on installation materials, and they would technically own the solar panel on your home, and you would lease it from them, basically. You would be buying power from the solar panel company, which is generating on your home, and then they would be the ones who were getting the rebates from the utility company, and selling it back to them. So the consumer, the person whose home it is, didn't actually own the solar panel, and they were leasing it from the company. And I read a really good NPR piece on this, kind of whether you should buy or lease solar panels, and basically leasing, leasing in a lot of other forms, takes a lot of the complication out of it. If you buy your own solar panels, you have to figure out all the federal government rebates you get, a lot of the state government rebates, because there are tons and tons of tax incentives for buying solar panels. And you would have to figure out kind of the net metering stuff on your own. With leasing, the solar panel company takes care of all of that, and it takes your complication out of it, and you're basically just buying energy from the solar panel company. With some of the changes from mandating that the net metering price be retail to wholesale, that's where it's hitting these solar panel companies the hardest, is that it makes some of these solar leasing contracts unviable for them, because they're not making that much of a profit selling the electricity back to the utility companies. So it seems to me like, and And like I said, there are huge incentives right now, tax incentives, to buy solar panels for consumers, even outside of the net metering pricing discussion. There are
Right.
tons and tons of incentives. So even outside of that, it seems to me to be a pretty strong indication that this is a even larger subsidy for homeowners. You know, they're not breaking even on selling energy back to the utility companies. They're making a ton of money on it. So, like I said, outside of the externalities of the climate change argument, it does seem to be a fairly large benefit to both the consumers and the solar panel companies, which are getting larger and larger, quite frankly, and having a lot of political power in and of themselves. So I'm not sure that, you know, adding this extra net metering subsidy on top of all the subsidies that exist already for clean power is all that good of an idea.
So I would say that our perspective would be that the tax credits and other things like that should go away. So that's certainly something that
You mean
that
like the federal, the state, all of that stuff?
federal, state, local, whatever
Yeah.
whatever there are. There's a production tax credit. There's all sorts of different rebates and incentives and things like that, which I don't think is good policy. And so that's something that we would favor eliminating. Um, that's certainly the case. The fact that the companies would be making less money if the net metering was at a lower rate. I mean, that's certainly true. I don't know that necessarily speaks to whether it's a subsidy or not. I could think, just to take an analogous case, you have companies like Uber and Lyft that are providing a service that they make a lot of money, and certainly if that some of that money comes at the expense of monopoly cab companies or something, but that alone won't tell you whether who's subsidizing whom. Maybe the fact that these companies are able to make such profits means that we've really been underinvesting in solar up to now. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that it gets really complicated, and that's as you know, climate change is a whole other issue. That's not really what we're talking about here. But ultimately, a lot of these problems, I think, are the result of the fact that a lot of jurisdictions operate under a regulated monopoly model. If we had a deregulated electrical system and companies could charge whatever they wanted and work out whatever agreements they wanted, then they would come to some arrangement. We wouldn't have to be worried about who's subsidizing whom. As long as you have the regulated monopoly model, then you have to try and calculate what are all the pluses and what are all the minuses, and of course it gets very complicated, and people want to bring in all sorts of different issues and so on and so forth. There is one thing that you didn't mention, which is yet another wrinkle, which is kind of we're starting to see now the development of electrical storage as a commercial thing. Tesla, for example, announced that they were doing units where you could store a certain amount of electricity, and it's not one thing that doesn't get remarked upon is those storage is actually sort of in competition with net metering, because higher net metering rates make storing electricity less attractive, because you could, instead of paying money in order to buy the Tesla Powerwall and store your electricity, you might be able to get more money just selling it back onto the grid. So it is possible that if you don't set the rate right, if you set it too high, that could discourage the widespread implementation of other clean energy technologies.
That's interesting because, not coincidentally, Elon Musk, who heavily involved in Tesla, is the founder of Solar City. So I
Right.
wonder, and obviously, a lot of solar companies are kind of invested in being able to create batteries where you can store your energy so that you are truly not off the grid, obviously, in a lot of cases, but you're truly, not having to buy any electricity from the from the local utility at any time of the year, whether it be high use or low use. So some of those battery storage systems, like you said, kind of go hand in hand with a lot of the solar policy. So I'm curious about something else that you said, talking about natural regulated monopolies. Is it really feasible to change some of those systems and, natural regulated local monopoly like we have here in DC, for example? I buy my energy from Pepco. There's literally no other way to get it. Is it feasible to change some of the larger, denser urban areas from regulated to a model of competition like they have in Texas?
Yes, absolutely, it's feasible, and I think the experience in Texas shows that it can be done. Where I live, uh, just north of Austin, I have an electrical provider. I recently switched my provider. I was on a contract. My contract was up, and so I shopped around. There's actually websites you can go to that will, compare different rates for you, and you can buy you can get service that is particularized to your needs, and there are special plans if you want all green energy. There's plans if you use a variable amount of energy, if you use lots of energy, little energy. It's great. So it's a good consumer service. It works fine, and I don't, having lived it and experienced it, I don't see any reason why that couldn't be a model for other jurisdictions, other than sometimes, there's political issues when you have an entrenched system.
That's true. So
I get a little wistful when I'm talking about deregulation.
So how does it work in your area? Do the competing providers work on the same grid network so that they're renting lines from each other, or what?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So generation is competitive. The sale of electricity is competitive. Transmission is still not, right. So
Right.
there's one set of electrical lines into your house. Any electrical company that's on the grid is able to use that. People, generators bid prices at the wholesale. The generators bid prices of electricity to go on the grid. The individual retail companies or other companies that are selling directly to you, they all use that electricity. So it's kind of it's a pure electricity with the possible exception of green electricity, whatnot. It's a fairly undifferentiated product, even more than gasoline. Normally, people typically do not care what gas station they're getting their gasoline from, because it's all the same. The only difference there is you have different grades or whatever, and you don't even really have that with electricity. It's all electricity. So that forces that's actually good from a consumer standpoint, because it forces different companies to compete basically on price and other service issues without trying to. There's no brand loyalty.
Sure, sure. So last topic I wanted to get to is you wrote recently on the R Streets website. You wrote a piece on the energy policy of Donald Trump and what our energy future would look like under a President Trump. Do you want to run down for me what you see in our future and
Possible future.
What possible future? Unfortunately, too plausible of a future, and what this means for us going forward, and what are the implications of the rise of Trumpism on energy policy?
Right. Well, so our street, we are a nonpartisan organization. We don't take a position on whether President Trump would be good or bad, but I did, give yield to the temptation of speculating a little bit about what a Trump administration energy policy might look like, specifically with regard to climate change, which is a topic, of course, that the Donald is been very expressive on. He said at various points that he thinks global warming is a hoax, possibly invented by the Chinese to make us more competitive, less competitive, excuse me. So, given that, you might think that the Trump would be the last person to do anything on climate. However, one of the other things that Trump does talk about over and over again is that he likes to make deals. He likes to make great deals, and he's not terribly ideologically wedded to any particular view, even his own views. Sometimes it seems like. So I think that there is definitely a possibility that if he were to become president, either as part of some broader tax deal or something else, he might decide to try and get something done on climate change. And of course, when it comes to climate change, the grandest of the grandest bargains that's out there is something that we've written a lot about at the Art Street Institute, which is revenue neutral carbon tax. We would put a fee on carbon emissions and then use the revenue from that to reduce other existing taxes, payroll tax reductions, reduce or eliminate our evil corporate tax, that sort of thing. So you can see that President Trump might really like that. I'm sure he's not happy about our corporate tax system any more than any of the other candidates, based on his tax plan and other statements. And there's a feature. One of the issues that you have if you put a carbon tax on emissions is that going to hurt our competitiveness with other countries? This is kind of what Trump was alluding to when he said that the Chinese came up with global warming, is that we're taxing our own manufacture, and so it's just all going to go overseas. And most carbon tax plans that I've seen include what are called border adjustments. Basically, if a product is imported from another country that doesn't have a carbon tax, the tax gets slapped on it at the border. And if we're exporting something to another country, then the amount that they've paid in the tax gets taken off, removed. So that's, on one level you could say, I could see how Trump might like that. That sounds a little bit like, sticking it to China and these other countries that he likes to talk about. It's a little different than, Trump likes to talk about like, I'm going to slap tariffs on goods from countries or companies that I don't like. This would be a little too broad based and rule of law natured, I think, for him to really get on board with. But you never know. The other thing that I looked at, which is kind of Trump might find appealing, is nuclear power. So this is obviously something that a number of countries get most of their electricity from nuclear power. It's pretty much a zero carbon source, and it's kind of it's money on the table in terms of climate right now, because a lot of the people who want some sort of action on climate change, environmentalists, people left of center or whatnot, a lot of them are really skeptical. They don't like nuclear power, even though it's a workable form of where you can get a lot of electricity that's zero carbon. Whereas on the other hand, people who conservatives who in many cases are skeptical or dismissive of climate change, they really like nuclear power, and it certainly fits in with a kind of national greatness scheme. It's building big things. Nuclear power plants are certainly big. So if I had to guess, if there were going to be some big Trump energy push, that might be it. Is just go huge on nuclear power.
Yeah, first thing that comes to my mind when I think what is Donald Trump going to do about basically any policy is what stake does he have in it? So, are any of Trump's businesses involved in either, coal mining or oil drilling, or in the creation of solar panels and clean energy, green tech products? Because to me, Trump, he's out for Trump, first and foremost. Now, I would also probably wonder, does he have any fealty to whoever his quote unquote base of voters are? And we've seen that his base is particularly strong in what we would call, white Appalachia. So people who might be involved in the dirty energy industry, people who might be coal miners or factory workers, who might have in the past belonged to unions before the precipitous decline of private sector union membership. But it also appeals to me that Donald Trump has no particular attachment to any of his voters. He doesn't really care who's voting for him at all. He doesn't have any, like you said, particularly strong ideological leanings on any policy issue. So, the China invented global warming thing is, and we see with some of his more ridiculous statements, he will say, well, I just said that because I understand deal making, and you have to come from a really crazy perspective to get to a deal that you like. So if he says, the Chinese invented global warming as a scaremongering policy, but and it sounds crazy, what to me that says is that maybe you're right. Maybe he is open to a deal on this. And, the people who support Trump, they often cite his ability to get deals done and get things done. And, to a lot of movement conservatives, they say, it's not, you shouldn't make a deal if the deal is on a policy that would be a bad policy no matter what you did. But
Munich was a deal.
Support, right, exactly. But some of Trump's support comes from people who just want to do things to do them and say we've done them. So I think you might be right. Does a carbon tax hurt Trump's industry? Does it hurt Trump's business interests? That's where I would think his guiding light would be on this. And like you said, if we have some border policies in place so that, we privilege American companies in any kind of carbon tax regime, that might appeal to him. And like you said, I think there is a certain aspect of nuclear power generation that speaks to the American greatness conservatism aspect of it. So, I don't see any of what you said as completely out of bounds, but I do think, number one here is how guarded are his interests in the process.
Yeah, so there was an article recently, I think it was in Slate, but I'm not 100% sure. I can send it to you, which basically a reporter went to a Trump rally and asked a bunch of people what they thought about climate change, and they were surprisingly kind of open-minded about it, at least compared to what you might expect, the kind of stereotypes about Trump-based voters, perhaps.
The stereotypes about Republican-based voters generally.
Right, yeah. And I don't know. I mean, Trump owns a lot of golf courses, hotels, casinos. I don't know that.
Not exactly the greenest places on earth.
Right. Yeah. Although there are some openings there. I think in terms of energy, but I don't know exactly how that would shake out in terms of whether that would make him more or less likely to want to do a deal on climate issues.
All right. I think that's about all the time we have for today. We'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for joining me, Josiah.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great.
And I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.